In the deep, silent void of space, where the stars twinkled like distant diamonds, a small, peaceful planet lay in the galaxy's far corner. It was a planet of lush green forests, vast oceans, and a peaceful people known as the Zelranes. They were a species that valued harmony, knowledge, and exploration. Zera, a young Zelrane girl, had always dreamed of traveling the stars, but that dream was about to turn into a nightmare. It started when a group of ruthless slavers from a distant galaxy discovered the Zelrane planet. They saw it as an opportunity to make money by capturing the innocent inhabitants. Zera's peaceful world was no match for their technology and power. In a single, terrifying sweep, the slavers launched a surprise attack. Ships filled with merciless soldiers descended upon the planet, capturing anyone they could find. Zera was out in the forest that day, collecting herbs with her younger brother. The sky was clear, and the sun was warm on her skin. But that peace was shattered when loud explosions rang through the air, followed by the hum of strange, large ships. Her heart raced as she looked up, seeing the ships descend from the clouds, their heavy metallic bodies blocking the sunlight. Fear gripped her chest as she grabbed her brother's hand and tried to run. But the sound of the ships growing closer filled her with dread. She didn't get far. The slavers had already surrounded their village. Armed soldiers, their faces covered with cold masks, charged at her. Her brother screamed as they were torn apart, dragged in different directions. Zera fought with all her strength, but she was no match for their superior strength and technology. A sharp pain surged through her neck as one of the slavers struck her with a dart, sending her into unconsciousness. When Zera awoke, she found herself in a small, cold cell. The walls were metal and bare, and the air was thin. She tried to move, but her wrists were shackled to the wall, a heavy collar round her neck. Panic surged through her, and she fought against the restraints, but it was no use. The metal was too strong. Her head spun as she remembered what had happened. The slavers, the capture, the screams. Suddenly, the door to her cell slid open, and two slavers entered. Their footsteps echoed in the silent room. Zera froze. She could feel their eyes on her, cold and cruel. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his face, stepped forward. "You're awake." "Huh," he sneered. "Good. You'll need your strength for what's coming next." Zera's mind raced. She had no idea what he meant, but the fear that gripped her heart told her it was something terrible. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to find any way out. But the only thing she saw was the cold metal of the walls. The slaver man laughed, seeing her attempt to escape. "You're not going anywhere, sweetie," he said, his voice low and mocking. "We've got plans for you." Big plans. Zera's heart sank as she realized the terrible truth. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was going to be used, forced to breed for profit. Her species, the Zelranes, were known for their beauty, strength, and the ability to produce offspring quickly. To the slavers, that made her and others like her valuable. To them, she was nothing more than an object, a tool to be sold for money. The man grabbed her by the arm, yanking her roughly to her feet. "Move," he ordered, dragging her out of the cell. Zera's legs were weak from the drugs they'd injected into her earlier, but she didn't have a choice but to follow Dot as she was led through the dark, twisting hallways of the facility. Zera's mind raced. She had to get out. There had to be a way. But what could she do? She was alone, weak, and trapped in a place she didn't understand. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her stomach twisted with fear. Every turn they made seemed to lead deeper into the facility, further away from any hope of escape. They reached a large door, and one of the slavers swiped a card to open it. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a room filled with bright lights and strange, cold equipment. It was a breeding room. The walls were lined with metal tables, and the air smelled sterile, like chemicals. Zera's stomach turned. This was the place where they planned to force her to breed. Tears filled her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't let them see her weakness. She had to fight. Even if it seemed hopeless, she had to find a way to escape this nightmare. Dot as she was pushed toward one of the tables. Zera's thoughts turned to her family, to her brother. Would she ever see them again? The fear of what was about to happen to her was overwhelming, but deep down Zera knew she couldn't give up. Not yet. Just as the slavers began to strap her down, there was a sudden noise. The door to the room slammed open, and a figure rushed in, catching everyone off guard. A man burst into the room, his face stern and filled with anger. He had a weapon in his hand, and for the first time since her capture, Zara felt a flicker of hope. The man's voice was low and commanding. "Step away from her," he said, his eyes burning with intensity. Now, the slavers froze, unsure of how to respond. Zara's heart raced. Was this a rescue? Was this man here to help her? But before she could hope too much, the slavers moved quickly, reaching for their weapons. The air thickened with tension as a confrontation seemed inevitable. Zara held her breath, unsure of what would happen next. The situation was dire, but for the first time since her capture, Zara didn't feel completely alone. Zara's heart pounded in her chest, the sound of it deafening in her ears. The room around her seemed to spin, a dizzying blur of cold metal and harsh fluorescent lights. The humans had dragged her into this place, this room that was filled with terrifying devices and strange equipment. The cold air made her shiver, but it wasn't the temperature that made her freeze. It was the realization of what was about to happen to her. Her eyes scanned the room, the sterile walls, the metallic tables, and the strange machinery that looked foreign and ominous. The slavers had promised her a future filled with misery, and it seemed like there was no way out. She was alone. The only sounds were the whirring of machines and the low mutterings of the two men. Standing in front of her, they were cold, emotionless, and they treated her like an object, not a person. She was just a tool to them, one they could use and discard when they were done. "Don't try anything stupid," one of them said, his voice rough, almost as if he was bored by the whole process. Zara couldn't even look at him. Her gaze shifted to the other slaver, who was busy checking the controls of the machinery. Her thoughts raced, her mind desperately trying to think of a way out. But everything about this place screamed hopelessness. The walls were thick and impenetrable, and the door they had entered through was locked tight. The slaver grabbed her roughly by the arm, jerking her out of her daze. "Move," he growled, pulling her toward the center of the room. Her body was weak from the drugs they'd injected earlier, but she fought to keep herself steady, not wanting to show any more weakness than she already had. She wasn't going to let them see her fear, but inside, her stomach twisted with terror. There was no escape. She couldn't run. She couldn't fight back. The man shoved her onto one of the cold metal tables, his hands strong and unrelenting. As they secured her wrists with cuffs, the harsh click of metal against metal echoed in the room, a sound that sent chills down her spine. Zara struggled, but it was no use. The restraints were too tight. She couldn't break free. She tried to look away from the machine looming over her, its metal arms extended like the claws of some monstrous creature. The machinery hummed, its purpose clear. They were going to force her into breeding, and there was nothing she could do about it. She had no strength left to fight, no strength left to hope. But as they tightened the restraints, something inside her snapped. It wasn't fear that gripped her now. It was anger. A deep, boiling rage rose up from within her, hot and fierce. She had been captured, humiliated, and dragged into this place, but she wasn't going to let them break her. She wouldn't let them destroy everything her people stood for. The Zelranes were peaceful, but they weren't weak. She had a purpose, and no matter how hard they tried to crush her, she wasn't going to give in. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp sound. Footsteps, heavy, rapid, and growing louder by the second. Zara's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could someone be coming to save her? For a brief, heart-stopping moment, she thought it was just her imagination, a flicker of hope in an otherwise hopeless situation. But then the door to the room slammed open with a violent crash, and Zara's breath caught in her throat. A figure stood in the doorway, a human man. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a rugged, determined look in his eyes. He held a weapon in his hand, its dark barrel glinting under the harsh lights. Zara's eyes widened as the man stepped into the room, his gaze locking onto her in an instant. The two slavers froze. One of them reached for his gun, but the man was faster. In the blink of an eye, the weapon was out of his hand, the slaver crashing to the ground with a grunt of pain. The other slaver lunged forward, but the man quickly disarmed him too, knocking him to the floor in a swift, brutal motion. Zara couldn't believe what she was seeing. This was real. A human was here, fighting for her, saving her. "Stay down," the man ordered, his voice low and commanding. His gaze shifted to Zara, his eyes filled with determination. He was here, for her, and there was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel less alone. She had been so close to losing all hope, but now, for the first time since her capture, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel in a long time. Hope. "Are you all right?" the man asked, his voice softening slightly. As he turned his attention back to her, Zara swallowed hard, too shocked to respond at first. She didn't know what to say. Her mind was still reeling from everything that had happened, from the moment she had been dragged into this nightmare, to the terrifying moments on the table, and now this an unexpected, almost unbelievable rescue. But as she looked into the man's eyes, something clicked. He was real. This wasn't some dream or illusion. He was a human, and for some reason, he was here to help her. Her voice came out in a whisper. Who are you?" The man gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "My name's Daniel, and I'm here to get you out of here." Zara's heart raced again. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. She felt a wave of relief wash over her. There was still a chance. She wasn't alone. This man, this human, was offering her a way out of this nightmare. She had no idea who he was or how he had managed to get here. But right now, none of that mattered. Daniel looked at the slavers on the floor, making sure they were incapacitated. "I've disabled the security systems for now, but we don't have much time. You need to move, Zara." Zara blinked. "How do you know my name?" "I heard them talking about you," Daniel explained quickly. "They were saying they'd use you for breeding. I couldn't let that happen." He glanced at the door, then back at her. "We need to move now." The urgency in his voice snapped Zara out of her daze. She nodded quickly, her heart still racing. She had no idea where they were going or what was ahead, but for the first time in days, she felt the stirrings of something she hadn't dared to feel before. Hope. She wasn't trapped anymore. Zara's legs felt like jelly as she stumbled behind Daniel, her mind still trying to catch up with the events that had unfolded in the past few minutes. The bright, cold lights of the facility blurred as they sprinted through the narrow hallways, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with the metallic scent of the place, a constant reminder of the danger that still loomed over them. But for the first time since her capture, Zara felt the faintest stirrings of hope. There was a chance, just a slim chance, but it was enough to keep her going. Daniel moved with purpose, his every step sure and swift. He glanced over his shoulder every few seconds, making sure Zara was keeping up. She had never seen a human move so efficiently, so confidently, as though he knew exactly what he was doing, as though he had been in these kinds of situations before. It gave her a strange sense of reassurance, though she had no idea who he really was or why he was risking his life for her. The walls around them were cold and unyielding, the harsh fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the floor. Zara felt like she was trapped in a maze. Every corner they turned, every door they passed, only led them deeper into the labyrinth of the facility. It was disorienting, and Zara felt a chill creep down her spine. The thought of being recaptured, dragged back to that terrible room, made her stomach churn. She had to keep moving. They had to escape. But as they rounded another corner, Zara's worst fears began to take shape. A loud, shrill alarm blared through the hallways, the sound piercing her ears and making her jump. The lights flickered for a moment, then went into a frantic, stuttering pattern. The alarm was followed by a series of loud, heavy footsteps echoing. In the distance, too many, too fast, and they were closing in. Daniel's face hardened, his expression grim. He didn't have to say a word for Zara to understand. They were being hunted. The slavers had discovered they were gone, and now they would stop at nothing to get them back. She had no idea how many soldiers were out there, but judging by the intensity of the alarm and the sound of boots pounding the metal floors, there were a lot. "Stay close," Daniel murmured, grabbing her wrist and pulling her along faster. Zara barely had time to react as they sped down another hallway, their footsteps echoing against the cold walls. The sound of pursuing footsteps grew louder, and Zira's chest tightened with fear. She could hear the slavers shouting orders to each other, their voices growing more frantic as they closed the gap. The facility's security was vast, and there were no guarantees they would be able to outrun them. They reached another set of heavy doors. But Daniel didn't hesitate. He reached for a panel beside the door, swiping a card that Zira hadn't even noticed he had. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and without pausing, Daniel pulled her inside. The room they entered was dimly lit, filled with large tanks and strange, whirring machinery. It was a storage area of some kind, and Zira didn't have time to wonder why Daniel had brought them here. They had no time. She could already hear the pounding footsteps approaching, and soon the slavers would be at the door. "Hide," Daniel whispered urgently. Now, Zira's heart raced as she quickly ducked behind a large, cylindrical tank. The metal floor was cold beneath her knees, but she ignored it, trying to quiet her breathing. Her body was trembling, every muscle on edge, as she peeked over the edge of the tank. She could see Daniel moving swiftly across the room, crouching behind another set of crates, his eyes scanning the door that the slavers were closing in. Zira could hear their voices now, too. They were just outside the storage area, searching the hallway. Zira held her breath, praying that they wouldn't find them. The last thing she wanted was to be dragged back into their hands, back to that room, back to the nightmare. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Zira could feel the adrenaline surging through her veins, her heart hammering in her chest. She barely dared to move, afraid that even the slightest sound would give them away. And then, the door to the storage room slid open and a group of slavers entered. Zira's stomach dropped as she saw them, their weapons raised, their eyes scanning the room. Her body tensed as she watched them move closer, her breath catching in her throat. They were just a few feet away, their footsteps so loud she could almost hear the pounding in her head. Zira clutched the edge of the tank, her hands shaking, praying that they wouldn't find her. Her thoughts were a blur of fear, but she knew she had to stay quiet, had to stay hidden. One wrong move, and it was all over. The slavers moved past her hiding spot, their heavy boots echoing in the silence. Zira's heart raced in her chest as she fought to stay still, to not make a sound. She could feel the sweat beating on her forehead, the tension in her muscles making it hard to breathe. It was a test of her nerves, a test of her will to survive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the slavers moved out of the room, their footsteps fading into the distance. Zira let out a quiet breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Her body sagged with relief. But the danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. Daniel's voice came softly from across the room. "They're gone. For now." Zira slowly stood, her legs trembling, her body sore from the tension. She met Daniel's eyes, and he gave her a brief nod. "We can't stay here long. We need to move again. But this time, we need to be smarter about it." Zira nodded, her mind racing with the realization that they weren't out of danger yet. They had no idea what lay ahead, but they had made it this far, and for the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. With that, Daniel turned, motioning for her to follow. Zira took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever came next. They weren't done running yet, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't running alone, and that thought gave her strength. Zira moved silently behind Daniel, her steps barely audible as they navigated the darkened corridors of the facility. The low hum of the lights above was the only sound that accompanied their hurried pace. The tension in the air was thick, and Zira couldn't shake the feeling that every step they took brought them closer to something dangerous, something she couldn't fully understand. Yet, she trusted Daniel. There was something in his eyes, something fierce and unyielding, that told her he would get them out. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it deep in her gut. They turned another corner, the shadows stretching across the walls like long fingers reaching out to grab them. Daniel's movements were precise, calculated. He glanced over his shoulder often, his eyes sharp, scanning every hallway, every doorway. Zira couldn't help but feel a strange mix of awe and fear as she watched him. He was no stranger to danger. It was clear in the way he moved, like someone who had been in situations like this before. They stopped at a dead-end hall, The only exit was a large metal door at the far end. But Zara knew they wouldn't be able to reach it without getting caught. A group of slavers had passed by earlier, and their voices still echoed faintly in her ears. They were close, too close. Daniel crouched beside a wall, his eyes scanning the area, his face hard with determination. "There's a service tunnel behind that door," he muttered, barely audible. "It leads to the lower levels. We'll have to move fast, but it's our best shot." Zara nodded silently, her mind racing. The fear that had plagued her since her capture surged again. But she pushed it down. She couldn't let herself fall. Apart, not now. She had to focus. Daniel approached the door and swiped a card across a reader embedded in the wall. A soft click echoed in the silence, and the door slid open with a hiss. The smell of oil and old machinery hit her, and she blinked. Against the sudden dimness inside, the tunnel was narrow, only wide enough for one person to move at a time. The walls were grimy, coated with years of dust and grime. Without hesitation, Daniel entered first, and Zara followed closely behind, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know where this tunnel would lead them, but she knew they had no other choice. Every minute spent in this facility brought them closer to discovery. Every minute was a risk. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the concrete floor. The walls of the tunnel pressed in on them, making it feel as if the world outside had disappeared altogether. The only light came from the weak glow of a flickering overhead bulb, casting eerie shadows along the passage. Zara's breathing was shallow, her mind consumed with thoughts of escape, of freedom. But even as they made their way through the narrow space, she couldn't stop wondering what would happen after they escaped. Where would they go? How would they survive? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sound, the distant hum of engines, the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps. Zara's breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. Daniel halted in front of her, his body tense, every muscle coiled in anticipation. He listened, carefully, his eyes narrowing. The footsteps grew louder, and Zara's stomach twisted. She could hear the slavers' voices now, muffled but unmistakable. They were searching for them, closing in fast. "We have to move," Daniel whispered urgently, grabbing her wrist and pulling her forward. Zara followed without question, her body responding on instinct. They darted down the tunnel, their pace quickening as they passed junction after junction, each turn a new risk. The walls around them felt like they were closing in, and Zara's breath quickened, her mind racing to keep up with Daniel's swift movements. She could feel the heat of his presence beside her, his body moving with a confidence that made her feel safer. Even though they were in constant danger, she didn't know who this man was or what had brought him to this place. But she could see now that he wasn't just some random passerby. He was a fighter, a survivor, and he wasn't going to let her die here, not if he had a choice. The tunnel twisted and turned, its narrow passageways seeming to stretch on forever. Zara's legs ached, her body beginning to feel the strain of running, but she pushed it down. There was no room for weakness, not now. Finally, they reached another door. This one was different, bigger, more secure. Zara's heart skipped a beat as Daniel moved quickly to a control panel beside the door, his fingers flying over the buttons. The door slid open with a loud metallic groan, and Daniel stepped through first, motioning for Zara to follow. They emerged into another hallway, though this one was darker, less populated. The air was stale, and the walls seemed to vibrate with the hum of distant machinery. Zara's eyes darted around, scanning for any signs of danger, but for the moment, they were safe. Daniel turned to her, his face hard but focused. "We're almost there, just a little further." Zara nodded, her body shaking with exhaustion, but determined to keep going. She couldn't stop now, not when she was so close to freedom. But as they moved forward, the unmistakable sound of boots echoed through the hallway. Zara's heart skipped. The slavers had found them again. She could hear their heavy footsteps growing louder, and the door they had just passed through slammed shut behind them. The chase was on. Daniel's expression turned grim. "We need to split up." "What?" Zara gasped, eyes wide. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "No, I can't. There's no time," Daniel interrupted, his voice low but urgent. They'll trap us if we don't split up. You go left, I'll go right. Meet at the end of the hall. Got it. Zira's mind raced. The fear that had been simmering under the surface threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to breathe. She had to trust him. He had gotten them this far. Got it, she whispered. They ran in opposite directions, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the hallway as the slavers' voices grew louder. Zira's pulse hammered in her ears as she turned the corner, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had no idea if she was running towards safety or straight into a trap, but there was no turning back now. The chase had begun, and she had no choice but to keep moving, keep fighting for her life. The echo of footsteps behind her seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the narrow corridor. Zira's pulse raced as she pushed herself harder, her legs aching, but she couldn't afford to stop. The fear of capture gnawed at her like a constant shadow. The slavers were right on her tail. She could feel them closing in with every second that passed. She didn't know how Daniel had managed to slip away. He had given her just enough time to break off and make a run for it, but she trusted him. She had no choice. The hallway stretched out before her, its dim lights flickering above her, casting shadows that seemed to twist and shift as she ran. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear them, the slavers shouting, their boots thundering through the metal floor, growing louder, closer. Zira's breath came in sharp gasps, her heart pounding like a drumbeat in her chest. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up. She had no weapon, no strength, no plan. But she couldn't give up. Not now. She glanced around, trying to find something, anything that could help. The walls were featureless, unyielding, offering no escape. The corridor ahead seemed to stretch on forever, endless and full of danger. She knew there was no way to outrun them. The only chance she had was to keep them confused, to make them lose track of her. Her mind raced, and then it hit her. A maintenance shaft. She remembered passing one earlier when she had first sprinted down this hallway. If she could get to it, maybe she could hide. Maybe she could shake them off long enough to find Daniel. She spotted it up ahead, a metal grate in the ceiling. Her heart skipped a beat. She had no idea if the hatch would be unlocked or if there was even enough room to squeeze through. But it was her only option. Without a second thought, Zira darted toward the hatch, her fingers trembling as she reached up to yank at the cover. The sound of the slavers' shouts was growing closer now. They were just behind her. She could feel their presence, could feel their hunger for her, their thirst to capture her again. Panic surged through her veins as she wrestled with the hatch, trying to pull it open. It was stuck. She tugged harder, her fingers slipping with sweat, but then, finally, it gave way. She scrambled up into the shaft, her body protesting against the tight space. The smell of dust and oil filled her nostrils as she crawled forward, pushing herself deeper into the narrow tunnel. She had no idea where it led, but at that moment, it didn't matter. It was dark, too dark to see, but she kept going, moving faster, each hand and knee scraping against the rough metal walls. Behind her, the slavers reached the hatch, their voices echoing through the corridor as they realized she had vanished. Zira could hear them shouting orders, the panic in their voices unmistakable. She knew they would be searching for her now, combing the halls and tunnels, trying to find any trace of her. But for now, she was free. She stopped only for a moment, trying to catch her breath. Her lungs burned with each inhale, and her entire body trembled from the effort. She wiped the sweat from her forehead, trying to calm herself, but the relief she felt was fleeting. She couldn't stay here for long. The maintenance shaft was a temporary refuge at best, and she had no idea where it would lead. She had to move, and she had to keep moving fast. She crawled on, one hand in front of the other, her body stiff from the uncomfortable position. But her mind was sharp. She couldn't stop thinking about Daniel. Had he gotten away? Had he found a way out of this madness? She couldn't leave him behind. She wouldn't. The sound of the slavers' footsteps faded as she crawled deeper into the shaft, but the thought of them finding her again was a constant presence in her mind. She had to find a way to get out of this place. She had to find a way to be free. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel began to widen, and Zira felt the air shift. There was something different here, something that felt like a change in direction. She crawled faster, her mind racing with possibilities. What if she was closer to the outside? What if this tunnel led to a place she could escape from? And then, just as the tunnel opened up completely, Zara heard a sound faint at first, but unmistakable, the unmistakable hum of a door opening. Her heart stopped. She wasn't alone. She froze, holding her breath, her ears straining to hear more. Was it a slaver, or could it be Daniel? The sound of footsteps grew closer, and Zara's stomach twisted in knots. If it was the slavers, she was done. But if it was Daniel, could he have found her? She waited, her pulse thudding in her ears, and then she heard a voice. It was low, hushed, but it was undeniably human. Zara. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was Daniel. Daniel, she whispered, the words barely leaving her mouth. I'm here. He replied, his voice steady but urgent. Stay where you are. I'm coming to you. Zara didn't need to hear anything more. She pushed herself through the last few feet of the tunnel and emerged into a small, dimly lit maintenance room. Daniel was standing there, his eyes scanning the room quickly before landing on her. He looked as though he had been through his own battle, his clothes torn and dirty, but he was alive. Relief washed over Zara, and for a moment, she just stood there, staring at him, her breath coming in shaky bursts. Daniel didn't waste any time. We don't have much time. The slavers will be looking for us everywhere. Zara nodded, the weight of their situation pressing down on her once more. They couldn't afford to stop now, not after everything they'd been through. Daniel moved toward her, his expression hardening as he scanned the room. We need to find a way out. Now, Zara's head spun with everything that had happened. She had no idea how they could escape this hellhole, but as long as she had Daniel by her side, there was still hope. There had to be. Together, they moved toward the door, their eyes meeting with a silent understanding. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost suffocating. As Zara and Daniel stepped into the narrow hallway beyond the maintenance room, every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. The soft scrape of Zara's boots against the metal floor, the faint hum of the station's ventilation system, and their own ragged breathing. The faint pulse of adrenaline still coursed through Zara's veins, but the weight of reality settled in. They weren't out of danger, yet Daniel led the way, his pace steady but quick, his every movement calculated, as if he were already thinking 10 steps ahead. Zara, trailing behind him, couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and anxiety. The man was a force unwavering and strong, but even he couldn't predict what lay ahead. The slavers were still out there looking for them, hunting them. Their mission was clear, and they would stop at nothing to capture Zara again. As they rounded another corner, Zara's eyes darted nervously down the darkened hallway, her senses on high alert. The silence felt wrong to still. It was as if the entire station was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the tension. Every step they took seemed to echo louder in her ears, amplifying the danger they were walking straight into. And then, without warning, the sudden sound of boots echoed down the hallway, fast, purposeful, and growing louder with each passing second. The slavers were near. Daniel's head snapped to the side, his eyes narrowing as he assessed their position. The hallway stretched in front of them, with nowhere to hide. His hand instinctively went to the small of his back, where a weapon was holstered. Zara felt a sudden pang of dread. Had they been spotted? Would they make it out alive? They're coming fast, Daniel whispered, his voice a low rasp. Get to that door, now. Zara's eyes followed his gaze to a thick metal door at the far end of the hall. She didn't know what was behind it, but at that moment, it didn't matter. It was their only chance. The urgency in Daniel's voice jolted her into action, and without a second thought, she sprinted toward the door, her legs burning with every step. Behind her, the sound of pursuit grew louder, the slavers' voices unmistakable, their harsh commands ringing in the air. Don't let them get away. They're in this section. Move. Zara's heart hammered in her chest. She could almost feel the hot breath of the slavers on her neck as she reached the door. With trembling hands, she grabbed the handle, praying it would open. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity as she twisted the knob, desperately pulling. But it was locked. Panic surged within her as she tugged harder, the pressure mounting. But the door refused to give. Come on, Zara. muttered under her breath, her fingers aching with the strain. From behind her, Daniel appeared. His movements swift and fluid as he reached the door, his expression hard. Without wasting a moment, he pulled a small device from his belt, a sleek, metallic tool that looked far more advanced than anything Zara had seen before. With practiced ease, he connected it to the door's control panel, and within seconds, there was a soft click. The door slid open, revealing a dark room beyond. Before Zara could step through, Daniel grabbed her arm, pulling her into the room. With him, the door shut behind them with a harsh clang, sealing them inside. The room was cold, much colder than the hallways they'd just left, and the dim light flickering overhead cast eerie shadows across the walls. Zara's eyes adjusted. Quickly, scanning the space, it appeared to be an old storage room, cluttered with broken machinery and crates, all covered in layers of dust. There was no sign of any immediate threat, but they couldn't afford to let their guard down. Daniel was already moving to the far corner, crouching low and peering through a small window set high in the wall. Zara joined him, her breath catching. As she looked out, the hallway beyond was still filled with slavers, their figures milling about, checking rooms, shouting commands, and scanning every corner. They were getting closer. "We're not safe here," Daniel muttered, his face tense. "But they don't know we're inside yet. We need to move." Now, Zara's eyes darted around the room, searching for another exit. There was no door visible from where they stood, and the only window was far above them. She could feel the panic rising again, the kind that threatened to choke her if she didn't focus. She couldn't afford to break down, not now, not when they were so close. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to find us," Zara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here before they figure out where we are." Daniel nodded, his gaze scanning the room once more. "I'm thinking, if we can get to the lower levels, we might be able to find an escape route. There's a maintenance tunnel down there, an old one. It could be our way out." Zara felt a surge of hope. A maintenance tunnel. If it was anything like the one they'd used before, it might be their ticket out. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger. Every second spent here increased the likelihood of being discovered. "Let's go," Zara said, her voice determined. "Lead the way." Daniel nodded, and without a word, he motioned for her to follow him. They moved quickly, staying low and silent as they made their way to the back of the room. The floor creaked beneath their feet, but Daniel's sharp eyes were always ahead, scanning for anything that could give them away. Zara stayed close, her body tense, every muscle ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. They reached a narrow door at the back of the storage room, and Daniel gave it a tentative push. It opened with a groan, revealing a dark stairwell that led down into the depths of the station. The smell of old pipes and stale air wafted up from below, but it was their only option. Daniel motioned for Zara to go first, and without hesitation, she stepped into the stairwell, her footsteps cautious and deliberate. The narrow space was oppressive, the walls closing in around her as they descended deeper into the heart of the facility. They reached the bottom, and Daniel paused, listening intently. The faint sound of distant voices echoed up the stairs, but there was no sign of immediate danger. Yet they couldn't afford to relax, not for a second. The slavers were still out there, and they would stop at nothing to capture them both. As they moved down the next stretch of the hallway, the dim lights flickered again, casting brief shadows across their path. Zara's heart was racing in her chest, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the growing realization that they were almost there. They were close to freedom, but it was a freedom that would only come with a price that neither of them could yet fully comprehend. But as long as they kept moving, as long as they didn't stop, there was still hope, and Zara wasn't about to give that up. The air was thick with tension as Zara and Daniel pushed forward through the dark, narrow corridors of the station, the sound of their footsteps echoing louder in the silence. They had come so far, narrowly escaping capture, racing through endless hallways and hiding in the shadows, but they were still far from safety. The slavers were relentless, and the momentary quiet that had fallen over the facility only meant one thing. They were regrouping, planning their next move. But Zara refused to let fear consume her now. After everything she'd been through, after everything she'd lost, she wasn't going to let them win. With every step, she felt the weight of the danger surrounding them. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, leaving her exhausted, her legs aching. But she pushed through the pain. Daniel, though quiet, remained a steady force beside her, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. There was no time to rest, no time for hesitation. She had to keep moving. Up ahead, Daniel whispered, pausing in his tracks. Zara followed his gaze. At the end of the hallway, there was a small, unobtrusive door, likely a maintenance exit of some kind. It didn't look like much, but it was their only chance. This was at the final push. Behind them, she could hear the faint sound of boots on metal floors, growing closer, signaling that the slavers had started their search again. Time was running out. Without another word, Daniel took the lead, his hand reaching for the door handle. Zara's heart skipped a beat as the door creaked open, revealing the unknown beyond it. She couldn't tell what lay in wait: an escape, or worse, another trap, but there was no turning back now. She stepped into the space behind him, every instinct screaming to stay sharp. The outside world felt like a distant dream to Zara. She had never known a life beyond the comfort and peace of her home planet, yet now the cold, metallic environment of this space station had become her reality. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped cautiously through the door. Her eyes quickly adjusted to the dim lighting, revealing a narrow, almost deserted hallway leading out toward what appeared to be a large docking bay. The sounds of the slavers' pursuit seemed farther now, but she couldn't afford to trust the silence. Daniel led them further into the maze, his movements precise and controlled, as though he knew exactly where he was going. Zara followed, her breath shallow, her every step deliberate. She glanced over her shoulder, expecting the worst. But for the moment, the silence held. They were close. She could feel it as they reached the end of the hallway. Zara saw the large, looming shape of a space vessel ahead, an old, battered ship that looked like it had seen better days. Its engines were quiet for now, but it looked functional enough to get them away from the station, far from the clutches of the slavers. Hope surged in her chest for the first time in what felt like forever. This was it. They were going to escape. But just as Zara took a step forward, the unmistakable sound of doors sliding open echoed behind them. Daniel cursed under his breath. "They've found us." Zara froze, panic rising in her chest. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She had to focus on what lay ahead. The door of the ship was just a few feet away now, but the voices of the slavers were growing louder. She could hear the unmistakable rhythm of their boots as they stormed down the hallway. Toward them, there was no more time. "Go, go now," Daniel shouted, pushing Zara toward the ship's entrance. Without thinking, she rushed toward the open door, praying that the slavers wouldn't catch them before they made it inside. But as she ran, something felt wrong. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The ship, was it really just a way out, or was it part of the trap? Before she could process the thought, she heard a shout behind her. The slavers had closed the gap. Zara reached the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the entry controls. It wouldn't open. Her pulse raced. "Daniel," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "The door's stuck. Keep trying," Daniel urged, his voice sharp. "I'll cover you." Zara's mind raced as she slammed her palms against the door, panic clawing at her chest. It had to open. They had no other choice. The sound of the slavers' footsteps grew louder, their voices growing clearer, their curses unmistakable. In the distance, Zara saw them, armed slavers, their weapons drawn, ready to take them back. Her heart sank. They were so close. They were going to be caught. "Open, open, open," Zara muttered to herself, her hands pressing desperately against the cold metal. The sound of the slavers shouting reached her ears, and she knew that if the door didn't open in the next few seconds, they would be done for then. With a soft hiss, the door slid open, revealing the dark interior of the ship. Zara didn't wait another second. She bolted inside, Daniel following close behind. He wasted no time, grabbing the controls and slamming them into place. The ship's engines roared to life with a low hum, the sound vibrating through the hull. The slavers were mere steps away from the ship now, but it was too late. The ship's thrusters ignited, propelling them forward, and the ground beneath them trembled as they began to lift off from the docking bay. Zara clutched the edge of a seat, her breath coming in short bursts. Her heart was still racing, but now it was filled with something else, something she hadn't dared to feel until now. Freedom. She looked at Daniel, who was already focused on the controls, his expression set in determination. Without a word, he adjusted the ship's trajectory, guiding them away from the station. Zara glanced out the small window. The space station grew smaller and smaller until it was just a speck against the vastness of space. For the first time since her capture, Zara allowed herself to relax just for a moment. They had escaped, but the journey ahead was still uncertain. There would be challenges, there would be battles, but Zara knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone anymore. And as long as they fought together, they had a chance. The stars stretched out before them, endless and bright, and Zara's heart felt lighter. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning.